Today, South Africa shocked the world with breaking news. For more, we go to our South African correspondent, Jack. Today, April 27th, 1994, apartheid was abolished, and a democratic government was formed in South Africa. If you'll remember, about 4 years ago, on May 4th, 1990, South Africa began the process of attempting to abolish apartheid and establish a democratic government, and today that has happened. Negotiations have taken place between Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk, the president of South Africa, and the African National Congress in Groote Schuur, South Africa. Countless uprisings and protests and revolts have led to this day and the abolishment of apartheid. Now, in order to dive deeper into the abolishment of apartheid, we have to first understand what apartheid is. And apartheid is complete separation of the races that was instituted in South Africa back in 1948. And apartheid in South Africa banned any contact between the white minority of the population, who held the most power, and the black majority of the population, who barely held any power and were regulated and ruled by the white population. The black population made up 75% of the total population in South Africa, with whites making up the other 25%. With the end of apartheid coming today, South Africa can start looking towards its future. And a big part of that future is a concept called globalization, which is the process by which businesses or other organizations develop international influence or start operating on an international scale. Now, while currently the business aspect of globalization does not come into play in Africa, it may in the future, but not right now. What globalization did for Africa, specifically South Africa right now, it helped South Africa abolish apartheid. And how did they do that? Globalization helped the abolishment of apartheid because in other countries, anti-racism and segregation movements have happened, and they have spread across the globe into South Africa. And that was a big reason why the abolishment of apartheid has happened. South Africa and its local governments have struggled with having the expertise or capacity to see any benefits to globalization whatsoever. However, if implemented correctly in South Africa, it could help the local economies and the unequal and flawed social systems. Therefore, globalization is a good thing. It has helped South Africa in the past and will continue to help in the future. For a more in-depth look at the end of apartheid, let's get into some background knowledge. First, when apartheid was first implemented, there was a ban on the African National Congress, or the ANC. At the beginning of apartheid, the ANC was banned from operating in order to ensure that there would be no threat to the current government. This upset most of the people in South Africa and led to high tensions and even more cause for disagreements between the blacks and the whites in South Africa. There was also the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela. Mandela was the leader of the ANC and was a major rallying point for black people fighting for equality in South Africa. He was looked up to and respected as a civil rights leader and advocate, and the pro-apartheid government wanted to ensure that he would not provoke an uprising. His imprisonment further angered and upset the black South Africans. More recently, after a few years, F.W. de Klerk, who is now president, moved Mandela to a new jail, but now not to prevent him from starting uprisings, but for his own protection against whites that are angry that apartheid is ending. Now we'll get into some specifics of the event itself. The who's, the what's, the where's, the why's, if you will. Who, Nelson Mandela, F.W. de Klerk, and the ANC, all three of them, worked together to come up with a solution to a problem. And what was this problem? And what was their solution? The problem was apartheid, and their solution was to end it. And that's what occurred in the negotiations to end apartheid. The negotiations took place in Groote Schuur, South Africa, from May 4th, 1990, to today, April 27th, 1994. Now, why were they doing this? They were doing it to end the segregation of whites and blacks and the minority power in South Africa. It is essential to understand that Mandela, de Klerk, and the ANC were integral to the end of apartheid. The blacks had grown increasingly upset about segregation and racism since the institution of apartheid, and their feelings had come to a boiling point. If apartheid wasn't abolished today, it is very likely that some sort of civil war would have occurred in South Africa. Now, you may be asking, how does the end of apartheid connect to globalization? Well, just before the end of apartheid, anti-segregation movements were happening all over the world. This helped apartheid become heavily protested. The end of apartheid was a great thing for South Africa, but the country still has many struggling economies and a flawed social system, which globalization has the potential to help. A couple of events really sum up how globalization affected the end of apartheid, and one was anti-racism movements across the globe. Just before today, the end of apartheid, the anti-segregation movements were happening all over the world. This helped apartheid become heavily protested. Another event was that South Africa needs help with social and economic systems. The end of apartheid is a great thing for South Africa, but the country still has many struggling economies and a flawed social system, which globalization can help. Today, the end of apartheid will be historically significant for many years to come, because it marks the end of active racism and segregation in a major country, that country being South Africa. It also provides a unique situation because of South Africa's relations with Southwest Africa, which is, as we all know, a United Nations territory. So, seeing what will happen with the tensions between the United Nations and South Africa, specifically when apartheid was in its prime, it should be interesting to see how those relations change in the coming days. If the end of apartheid is so historically significant, it would make sense that people all over the world will be studying about the end of apartheid. Now, I believe it should be studied because it marks the end of extreme racism and segregation in a major African country, South Africa. And I think it's also unique because it provides hope to people who are dealing with the same situation in another country right now. Racism, segregation, this could give people hope in other countries that they can overcome what they are dealing with, because we just overcome a major hurdle in South Africa. In order to help people further understand the end of apartheid, we've acquired some images and graphs that we'd like to show you. First, we have a population graph of South Africa from just last year. Now this population graph depicts the different races in South Africa and their percentage of the population. As you can see, the population is 75.89% black, 8.9% colored, and only 11.5% white. This begs the question, why do the whites have power in South Africa over the black majority of the population? Another interesting part of the end of apartheid is ANC leaders Nelson Mandela and his relationship with South African President F.W. de Klerk. Here's Mandela and de Klerk at a press conference this morning detailing the end of apartheid and what it means for South Africa. I'm Jack Mezzi here in South Africa with the Random News Station. Now, back to the studio.